Story 1. The Vanishing Sun. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the suburban neighborhood. Whispers of suspicion drifted among the residents. It all began with the disappearance of young Tommy, the son of Mr. and Mrs. Peterson. Tommy was a cheerful boy, always seen riding his bike around the block or playing catch in the front yard. But one day he vanished without a trace, leaving behind a community haunted by unanswered questions. Mrs. Johnson, who lived next door to the Petersons, couldn't shake off the feeling of unease that settled over the neighborhood after Tommy's disappearance. She recalled the days leading up to his vanishing, how Mr. Peterson's behavior grew increasingly erratic. It started with late-night gatherings in the backyard, hushed conversations carried by the wind. Mrs. Johnson would often catch glimpses of Mr. Peterson pacing back and forth, his eyes darting nervously as if he was expecting someone, or something. Then came the strange deliveries, a flurry of packages arriving at odd hours, quickly whisked into the house before anyone could get a good look. Mrs. Johnson couldn't help but wonder what Mr. Peterson was hiding behind closed doors. The breaking point came one stormy night when Mrs. Johnson heard muffled cries coming from the Petersons' house. Concerned, she ventured out into the rain, her umbrella shielding her from the relentless downpour. Peering through the fogged-up window, she saw Mr. Peterson hunched over a makeshift table, his hands trembling as he meticulously arranged photographs and newspaper clippings. But it was what lay beneath the table that sent a shiver down Mrs. Johnson's spine, a pile of dirt-streaked shovels and a tattered backpack, the same one Tommy used to carry on his adventures around the neighborhood. The next morning, Mrs. Johnson couldn't shake off the feeling of dread that gripped her as she watched Mr. Peterson load his car with bags filled with unknown contents. She knew she had to act fast before another child fell victim to whatever sinister secrets lurked within the walls of the Petersons' home. Summoning every ounce of courage, Mrs. Johnson approached the authorities, her heart pounding in her chest as she recounted her suspicions. It wasn't long before the police descended upon the Petersons' house, their stern faces betraying the gravity of the situation. What they uncovered sent shockwaves rippling through the neighborhood, a hidden cellar beneath the house, its walls lined with photographs of missing children and newspaper clippings detailing their disappearances. And, at the center of it all, a grief-stricken Mr. Peterson, his hands stained with the blood of his own son. As the truth came to light, the once quiet neighborhood was left reeling in disbelief, haunted by the chilling realization that monsters could lurk behind the most unsuspecting facades. Story 2. The Troubled Neighbors. The Smiths were the talk of the town, their arrival in the neighborhood sparking whispers of curiosity and apprehension. With their unkempt lawn and boarded-up windows, they stood out like a sore thumb amidst the neatly manicured lawns and pristine facades of their neighbors' homes. But it wasn't just their appearance that set the Smiths apart. It was the unsettling aura that seemed to surround them, a palpable sense of danger that sent shivers down the spines of those who dared to venture too close. For Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, who lived next door to the Smiths, the sense of unease only grew with each passing day. They could often hear raised voices emanating from the Smiths' house, punctuated by the occasional sound of breaking glass. But it was the sight of real guns being brandished in broad daylight that sent shockwaves rippling through the neighborhood. Mr. Thompson recalled the day he peered through his window, his heart pounding in his chest as he watched Mr. Smith emerge from the house, a rifle slung over his shoulder as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Terrified for their safety, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson knew they had to take action before it was too late. They reached out to the authorities, their voices trembling as they recounted their encounters with the troubled neighbors next door. But their pleas fell on deaf ears, dismissed as nothing more than the overactive imaginations of paranoid neighbors. It wasn't until tragedy struck that the true extent of the Smiths' darkness was brought to light. Late one night, the neighborhood was jolted awake by the deafening sound of gunfire, followed by screams of agony that pierced the stillness of the night. By the time the authorities arrived, it was too late. The Smiths had turned their guns on each other in a fit of madness, leaving behind a trail of devastation in their wake. As the sun rose over the shattered remains of the Smiths' house, the neighborhood was left grappling with the aftermath of the tragedy, haunted by the chilling realization that evil could lurk behind even the most unassuming facades. Story 3. The Eerie Neighbor Misses. Anderson had always been a recluse, her presence in the neighborhood shrouded in mystery and suspicion. With her curtains perpetually drawn and her door firmly locked, she seemed to exist in a world of her own, untouched by the hustle and bustle of the outside world. But it wasn't just Mrs. Anderson's reclusive nature that sent chills down the spines of her neighbors. It was the eerie behavior that she exhibited whenever she ventured outside. Mr. and Mrs. Davis, who lived across the street from Mrs. Anderson, recalled the day they first noticed something was amiss. It was a crisp autumn morning, the leaves crunching beneath their feet as they set out for their daily walk. As they passed by Mrs. Anderson's house, they couldn't help but notice her standing in the front yard, her eyes fixed on something, or someone, that only she could see. Her lips moved in a silent whisper, her hands twitching nervously at her sides as if she was engaged in a conversation with an unseen entity. The sight sent shivers down Mr. and Mrs. Davis's spines, their pace quickening as they hurried past Mrs. Anderson's house, eager to escape the unsettling presence that seemed to linger in the air. But it was the disturbing discovery that awaited them upon their return home that truly shook them to the core. As they approached their front door, they noticed a single red rose lying on their doorstep, its petals wilted and stained with blood. Terrified, Mr. and Mrs. Davis reached out to the authorities, their voices trembling as they recounted their eerie encounter with Mrs. Anderson and the chilling discovery that followed. But much like their neighbors before them, their pleas for help fell on deaf ears, dismissed as nothing more than the overactive imaginations of paranoid minds. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks turned into months, the neighborhood remained gripped by fear, haunted by the enigmatic figure of Mrs. Anderson and the dark secrets that lay hidden behind her closed doors. And though the truth of Mrs. Anderson's eerie behavior may never be fully known, one thing was certain: the chilling presence that she cast over the neighborhood would linger in the hearts and minds of its residents for years to come.